And that one was kind of funny because I had gotten that idea and started writing it. And do you remember the crematorium in Georgia?
Yes.
Outside of Georgia,
You
where
mean
they
the
found
one-
that this guy had... That story broke, and I sort of like, oh, this is just kind of strange. This was so much like At the Stroke of Madness. I've had that happen several times with my books, where real life starts imitating what I've written. And
we published a book this spring that uses that very same case.
Really?
I'm not going to mention who it was or the author because it's a huge spoiler, but I realized and she was very good with it because it was just at the end of the book when I finally figured out where she was going with this story. But I think that people are kind of fascinated with the idea that there's a funeral home or crematorium or whatever that's not really doing its job. Mm-hmm. You know, and that, well, I mean, it's the same thing that kind of drives, you know, that huge effort after the World Trade Center or after various disasters, you know, to actually identify the bodies. Although in a funeral or crematorium situation, it isn't that you don't know the person died, which is part of the question in these larger catastrophes, but rather, I don't know, why it is that people have so much trouble with like an unburied
body.
Yeah, or the wrong... To me, I decided years ago on a trip to Peru, we went to visit an ossuary in a cathedral, and after that, I'm not Roman Catholic, and so I had not really been in the crypts of a cathedral. And this is when I was a member of the Virginia Bar, so it was like back in the 1970s, the Virginia Bar used to go on nifty places to have annual meetings and all. But anyway, here we are down below this cathedral, and there are bins of bones and a tasteful circle of skulls in a well. And, you know, then we'd have thigh bones here, and and I thought to myself, I don't want to survive to be one of those. I mean, I'd much rather go, who was it, Dorothy Parker, better burned than wormed? I don't remember if it's Dorothy Parker, but that's a famous quote, better burned than wormed, whoever said it. Maybe 18th century for all I know. But that really cemented for me the experience of watching, you know, these just heaps and heaps of bones, and you wouldn't have any idea whose they were or whatever. And I thought, why survive to have that happen to you? I mean, when it's over, you know, unless you want to go with the Egyptian routine, you know.
That's one thing that every culture, no matter what it is, sort of has a fascination with not just death, but with the remains, you know, and what you do with them.
But some of them, as with Egypt, it's because they truly believe that for a resurrection you had to have the body, and that's why they went through all that mummification process and all. But if you don't believe that the physical shell, you know, is required for whatever may come after, then why keep it?
Yeah, well, I'm with you, but it sure offers a lot of what-if questions that are grist for novels.
We were just in Venice, and, you know, there's an island, and New Orleans does exactly the same thing. These are cities with serious water table problems.
Oh, sure, yes.
And if I have this right, I could be wrong, but I don't think so, in both places, a fresh corpse gets 10 years, essentially, in the mausoleum, whatever it is. And at the end of that time, to make room for the next thing, they shovel them all out, you know, out the back. San Michele is the island in Venice. And you can identify it because in Europe, or at least in the eastern that whole Mediterranean area, the cypress tree is a tree of mourning because it's kind of like reaching to God, whatever it might be. And so funeral areas, cemeteries and all, tend to be planted thickly with cypress. So you have this island in the lagoon in Venice that is like, you know, all these cypress trees growing up.
Oh, wow. And
then it's all full of mausoleums because they can't really dig into.
They have to do above.
Right. And I'm sure I have read that is true, if not all over, at least in part of New Orleans, the same problem.
I'm sure.
You know, and so the body would have, in other words, kind of a tendency in a mausoleum in a building, you know, and at the end of the tenure, out it goes and something else. So I thought, well, if that's going on, wouldn't it be better just to burn it in the first place and move on
here? Make more sense.
Yeah.
Yes.
So I don't know how we got into all this, but I did think that the Georgia case, which grabbed the national imagination, was so interesting because it did reveal how distressed people are.
Yes.
You know, at the thought that they'd either not buried anybody or buried the wrong person or buried part of a person.
Well, it
Weren't
was
they like all over the woods and the trees, the bodies?
in lakes and stacked in some of the
hideously
outbuildings.
unhealthy too.
Oh, yes. Yes.
I mean, they think at Haworth, the Brontes, who all died of mysterious things, and all. One theory is that it's because the water source was through the cemetery.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
That would be a good reason,
It was
yes.
a very unhealthy, situation, and nobody really thought about stuff like cholera and typhoid and all
sure.
those different things. But it would be relatively easy to contaminate. So I think the Georgia thing, in part, was not just missing the body, but there were really serious
health issues.
Definitely. Going on.
Yes, because it was a rather large area too, if I believe. Was it on a lake or was it on a river? I don't remember, but it was.
I just remember you got a sort of macabre vision of bodies all over the landscape.
I just remember when I came up with the idea of stuffing bodies into barrels, that was sort of a horrific kind of idea for me, that, would the readers be sort of shocked about that? And then when that story broke, I was like, well, this is, and that happens to me so often, where real life is so much stranger than fiction. Anything that you can come up with.
You seem to have a curious nexus. A lot of people, write books, and I mean, lots of people say to me, how did the Da Vinci Code do so well? I mean, what is there about this book, which is not Nobel Prize quality fiction?
And what do you usually tell them?
And I think, and this was also true, I thought of John Griffith's book, The Firm, that the book happened to catch a sort of moment in the public when stuff was going on. When The Firm published, law firms, everybody wanted to believe that there really could be a law firm of crooked law firm, crooked lawyers. And part of it was that law firms had begun to advertise. There was a sort of sleaziness that had come into this dignified. I was a lawyer, so I say things like that. But there was a lot going on, a dissatisfaction and a perception, perhaps, of the bar, that it wasn't as austere and as
close to real life,
ethical as it had once been. It had become touched with this and that, and so Griffith's book caught the public imagination at the right time. With the Da Vinci Code, we had a pope that was dying, or clearly in poor health. He was in poor health, if I remember right, for several years before he died. So there was an unease there, about how all that was going to go. You had all the serious scandals that had attached to the Catholic clergy.
And secrets.
Always
secrets.
All kinds of things. But the point is that at that moment in time, people were feeling uneasy about the church. And also a book that played into that, in the same way that the Griffith book played into law firms, it just kind of sparked stuff. Plus, in the Da Vinci Code case, he published it as a thriller, and since you're involved in the International Thriller Writers Association, which we'll come back to in a minute, that books like that are really written, thrillers are written to entertain people. They're not scholarly works. But the problem with the Da Vinci Code is that it appeared to be a scholarly work, and in fact, it was a thriller and largely used secondary sources. And so a lot of the controversy that was generated was because people had a different expectation of what level the book was pitched to, and the underlying, the supporting history and other things, which the author never intended.
No.
I mean, he really, he didn't misrepresent it, but it was perceived as though he were like a full professor at Princeton or something, instead of a high school English teacher in New Hampshire, which is a worthy thing to be. But he didn't have that high scholarly standard. I mean, why should he? He was just writing popular fiction. There was no reason for him.
It's sort of like, where does the fact where does the facts stop, and the author's allowed some sort of creative license to be.
Well, true. Unfortunately, there was a fair amount of stuff he got wrong that he shouldn't have, like the geography of Paris, which could have been avoided with just an ordinary guidebook or a map or something.